Welcome to Signal Ahead. I'm Alfred. Today's briefing, Geopolitics SD Relevant. Wednesday, June 24. This is the synthesis above the noise, not the headlines, but the deep currents beneath them. Let's get into it. Let me begin with a number that on its face has nothing whatsoever to do with war. 3%. That is the proposed water rate increase for San Diego County in the year ahead. And here is the curious thing. That figure is going up, but it is going up by less than it might have. The reason is not some technological miracle. It is a pair of unglamorous water-sharing agreements, signed quietly this spring, in which one regional agency agreed to sell a measured quantity of water to another over 21 years at a fixed price. Boring, you might say, and you would be right. But hold that thought, because that boredom is the most important thing I shall say to you today. Now let me set beside it something that is not boring at all. This spring the Strait of Hormuz closed. Iran, in response to strikes against it, demonstrated that it could simply switch off one of the great arteries of global commerce, and the economic shockwaves traveled, as they always do, far beyond the Gulf. Traffic has since picked up, well below what it was, as technical teams haggle in Switzerland over the precise wording of a ceasefire whose very legal status is in doubt. Is it a treaty? Is it a memorandum of understanding? Does the difference bind anyone to anything? Lawyers are presently earning their keep over precisely that ambiguity. Here is the connection a casual reader of the morning headlines will miss. The water agreement in San Diego and the closure of the Strait of Hormuz are the same story told at 2 volumes. Both are about a single, unfashionable question that now sits at the center of geopolitics. How do you secure the flow of an essential thing through a chokepoint you do not fully control? The San Diego Water Authority answered it the dull way: diversify your suppliers, lock in long contracts, reduce your dependence on any one channel. 5 experts asked how the world should adapt to an unreliable Hormuz arrived, independently, at exactly the same counsel. Reduce reliance. Build redundancy. Treat the chokepoint as a thing that will fail again, because it will. That is the state of the field, and it is a quieter, stranger state than the explosions suggest. We have spent a generation assuming that the great flows of oil, of water, of goods, of attention would simply continue because it was in everyone's interest that they should. That assumption is now dead. The defining geopolitical act of our moment is not conquest. It is the deliberate interruption of a flow by an actor who has calculated that the threat of interruption is itself a form of leverage. Iran did not need to sink a single tanker to send the price of everything wobbling. The demonstrated capacity was the weapon, and notice how the technology of interruption has democratized. In southern Lebanon, fiber-optic guided drones, a killing technology refined in the fields of Ukraine, have arrived, frustrating a far larger military because a thin glass thread cannot be jammed. In Italy, a crewed jet trainer flew alongside an autonomous combat drone and took control of it in flight by radio. India launches 3 new warships and in the same breath remains dependent on foreign suppliers for the components that matter most. Everywhere you look, the capacity to disrupt is spreading downward and outward into smaller hands at lower cost, while the capacity to guarantee uninterrupted flow grows more expensive and more doubtful. The cost curves are crossing. That crossing is the news, which is why I want you to resist the headline seduction. One outlet declares that America won its war with Iran won on points, like a boxing match decided by the judge's cards rather than a knockout. Perhaps. But a contest settled on points is a contest both sides walk away from still standing, still capable, still calculating the next round. The strait can close again. That sentence, "it could happen again," is the true legacy of the spring, more durable than any ceasefire memorandum whose legal nature nobody can quite agree upon. So over the next while, I want to follow this single thread through the tangle. We shall look at how states are quietly rewiring themselves for a world of interruptible flows, the long contracts, the diversified suppliers, the redundancy that looks like waste until the day it looks like wisdom. We shall look at how the tools of disruption have outrun the tools of guarantee and what that does to the calculations of large powers and small alike. And we shall ask the uncomfortable question underneath all of it, whether resilience, the dull and patient business of not depending too heavily on any one channel, is now the scarcest and most valuable commodity in international affairs. Because the lesson of the season, properly understood, is not delivered in a single thunderclap. It is delivered the way a horse delivers a lesson, quietly, without flattery, and only to those willing to stop performing composure long enough to feel the ground move. Let us begin there. There's a phrase buried in a piece about the Strait of Hormuz that I keep returning to because it does something rather unusual. It tells the truth about what we've actually learned. Iran, the analysis observes, has clearly demonstrated its ability to shut down the strait. Note the verb, not threatened, not might, demonstrated. The thing was tried, it worked. The economic shockwaves rolled out across the world, and now everyone who depends on that narrow channel of water has been handed a piece of knowledge they cannot unknow. The conclusion the authors draw is the interesting one. The lesson isn't who won the standoff. The lesson is that the standoff is now permanently thinkable. And so the incentive shifts, not toward winning the next confrontation, but toward not being so exposed to it in the first place. That, I'd suggest, is the deep current running beneath all the headlines this week. We are watching, in a dozen separate theaters, the slow migration from a world organized around chokepoints to a world organized around redundancy. And once you see it, you cannot stop seeing it. Consider what a chokepoint actually is. It's a point of maximum efficiency that is also a point of maximum vulnerability. The Strait of Hormuz is a chokepoint. A single utility company supplying an entire region is a chokepoint. A water system that draws from one distant source is a chokepoint. A supply chain that runs through one foreign manufacturer for one critical component is a chokepoint. For decades, the logic of globalization was the logic of the chokepoint: find the most efficient route, the cheapest supplier, the single best source, and pour everything through it. Efficiency was the supreme virtue. Redundancy was waste. The current is reversing. And the local stories tell it as plainly as the geopolitical ones, if you listen. Take the water authority proposing a 3% rate increase, modest, below inflation, and notably lower than earlier projections. Why lower? Because of 2 water-sharing agreements signed this spring, selling surplus supply to other districts. Read that carefully. A region that spent years and fortunes building independent supply desalination, long-term transfers, the whole apparatus of not depending on any single source, has now built enough redundancy that it can sell the surplus. The very over-provisioning that looked like expensive caution becomes, in time, a revenue stream. That is the economics of redundancy made visible. You pay a premium for resilience, and resilience, it turns out, has a market. Then set beside it the report finding that switching the city away from its private utility to public power might be feasible: $7 billion in savings over 30 years, even on conservative estimates. Whatever one thinks of the politics, the structural impulse is identical to Hormuz. A community looks at its single supplier, recognizes the dependency, and begins to ask, what would it cost to control our own channel? The question itself is the symptom. People who feel secure in their chokepoints don't commission feasibility studies on alternatives. And the military theaters are simply this same logic, accelerated and weaponized. The fiber-optic guided drones now appearing in southern Lebanon, the autonomous aircraft being flown from a trainer jet, the observation that any military in conflict will encounter the technologies first seen in Ukraine. What is all of this, if not the relentless dispersal of capability? The chokepoint in warfare was always the expensive, centralized platform, the carrier, the fighter, the thing that took a decade and a fortune to build, and that if lost, could not be replaced. The current runs toward the cheap, the many, the distributed. And here is the cruel symmetry. A nation that has spent generations perfecting the exquisite single platform discovers that the world has filled up with cheap, swarming alternatives that don't care how perfect its carrier is. The chokepoint becomes the liability. Even India's 3 new naval ships, an undoubted boost to firepower, carry the asterisk that the country remains dependent on foreign suppliers for key technologies. There's the chokepoint again, hiding inside the show of strength. What unites these is a single recognition spreading through every system at once. Dependency that was invisible while it worked becomes intolerable the moment it's demonstrated to be exploitable. And the demonstration is the thing. You can warn about a vulnerability for years and nobody moves. Show it being used once, close the strait, fail the grid, swarm the fleet, and the whole calculus of every actor downstream changes overnight. The threat doesn't even have to recur. Its mere thinkability does the work. So the deep current is this: efficiency built a world of beautiful, fragile single points, And that world is now, deliberately and at great cost, dismantling itself in favor of slack, duplication, and distance. We are paying to be less efficient. We are paying for the privilege of not being held hostage by our own cleverness. It looks like waste. It is in fact the price of not being surprised. And the regions, the militaries, the utilities that grasp this early will pay it as an investment. The ones that don't will pay it later, and not in money. So where does all this leave us? We've spent our time tracing the shape of a particular kind of disruption, the way a single choke point, a single narrow passage of water, can send tremors through the entire architecture of the global economy. Now I want to ask the harder question, the one that matters when the headlines have faded and the negotiators have gone home. What does it mean? Not what happened, what follows from what happened. The first thing to sit with is that a strait was closed, traffic collapsed, and then traffic resumed, but resumed at a fraction of its former volume. And here is the crucial point. Even with the immediate crisis easing, the lesson does not unlearn itself. A capability, once demonstrated, becomes a permanent feature of everyone's planning. The fact that one nation showed it could throttle a quarter of the world's seaborne oil does not evaporate when the ships start moving again. It lodges itself in the calculations of every government and every shipping firm that depends on that water. The threat need not be repeated to remain effective. It simply has to have happened once. And that produces what I'd call the diversification reflex. When a vulnerability is exposed, the rational actors begin, quietly and expensively, to route around it. New pipelines get dusted off. Alternative ports suddenly look worth the premium. Strategic reserves get topped up. None of this happens overnight, and none of it makes headlines, which is precisely why it's worth watching. The second-order effect of a closed strait is not the price spike, that's first order, and it self-corrects. The second-order effect is the slow, structural rewiring of dependence, a process that will outlast the particular crisis that triggered it by years, perhaps decades. Watch for the boring infrastructure announcements. They tell you more than the communiques. Then there's the matter of how these things are settled, or rather, how ambiguously they're settled. We've seen a war wind down not with a treaty signed in a great hall, but with a memorandum whose very legal status is in dispute. Is it binding? Is it merely an understanding? The confusion is not an accident, and it is not trivial. Ambiguity is a tool. It lets both sides claim what they need to claim to their own people, while leaving the door open to walk back from any commitment that becomes inconvenient. The cost is that nobody quite knows what was agreed, which means the next dispute starts from a foundation of contested memory. When the inspectors and the nuclear monitoring become the sticking point even as the broader deal is being finalized, you're watching the seam where the ambiguity will eventually tear. That seam is what to watch. There's a third implication, and it's the one I find most quietly significant. Notice who travels where when these crises unfold. A president heads not to a Western capital, but to a neighbor, to Islamabad, while the technical teams hammer out details elsewhere. The grammar of alignment is shifting. The states caught nearest these disruptions are not waiting passively to be reassured by the old guarantors. They are building their own hedges, their own regional understandings, their own redundancies. And you see the same instinct everywhere if you look. A navy commissioning new ships, while still depending on foreign suppliers for the parts that matter most. Drone technologies pioneered in one war showing up, almost immediately, in another. The tools and the tactics travel faster than the treaties. What's learned in one theater is fielded in the next within months. That diffusion of capability, of technique, of the simple knowledge that a thing can be done, is the real engine of our uncertainty. And let me draw a thread back to something closer to home, because the same logic governs the mundane. We heard of a water authority announcing a rate increase, but softening it through long-term supply agreements signed quietly in the spring. That is the diversification reflex in miniature. A region that knows its water is vulnerable does not wait for the drought. It signs the deals, it builds the redundancy, it pays the premium now to avoid the catastrophe later. Or consider the question of whether a city ought to control its own power, when the analysis suggests billions in savings from owning the thing it currently rents. The instinct is identical. When you've glimpsed how fragile your dependence is, you start asking whether you ought to own the choke point rather than be at its mercy. The strait and the water main are the same story told at different scales. So what do we watch for? Watch the infrastructure that gets built quietly. Watch the deals signed without fanfare. Watch the language of agreements for the deliberate fog. Watch where leaders travel and who they reassure. And watch how quickly a demonstrated capability becomes everyone's assumption. The crisis is never really the event. The crisis is the permanent adjustment that follows, and that adjustment is already underway, whether or not anyone announces it. That, I think, is the signal ahead. That's the signal for today. The noise will keep coming, we'll keep finding what's underneath it. This has been Signal Ahead with Alfred. Until next time.